Pine Ridge is located in the southern region of South Dakota in the Oglala Lakota Native American Reservation. Pine Ridge was established in 1889, and its people are closely tied to the great chief Crazy Horse. Pine Ridge is the 8th largest reservation in the nation, with over 3,468 square miles of land, or roughly 3 times the size of the state of Rhode Island.
Lies there, the source or the location of the infamous massacre of 1890, where the 7th Cavalry massacred about 350 Muslim women and children, and also the Wounded Knee occupation of 73, where over 71 days the American Indian movement sort of occupied the area with a lot of residents there as well. And over the 71 days, the U.S. government, by their own figures, fired approximately 500,000 bullets in on those activists, and a couple of the American Indian movement people there, or locals, one was a local, were killed by the government bullets.
The town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, was seized on February 27, 1973, by followers of the American Indian movement who staged a 71-day occupation in protest against Dick Wilson and his followers, the Goons, the guardians of Oglala Nation, after they failed to impeach him.
Well, during the night, the first night, when the takeover began, and shots were fired initiated by the BIA and of course responded to by members of our caravan that had went in there, then we decided to block the roads, because if the BIA and all the feds were going to come out from Pine Ridge, then we had to have some kind of control of the situation. Initially, like I said, we didn't know we was going to be there. But after the elders made a decision, not elders, but everybody that was in the meeting at the church at Wounded Knee on the 27th of February 1973, we didn't limit people from talking or what their opinions were. Everybody got to say what they wanted to say regarding why we were there. Trying to draw attention to the treaty issue, trying to draw attention to the corruption that existed on the reservation. But it was decided that we would stay there. Then we had to secure the perimeter and secure the area. And remember, we had families that lived within this small town, both right outside of the town in terms of government housing, and then people who traditionally lived there, including white store owners who owned the Wounded Knee trading posts. So immediately we secured the trading posts because they had weapons in there that they were selling on, just as a gun dealer. And so we went in there and secured those weapons. We had a few weapons with us in terms of the caravan, individual owners. And so then we set up roadblock on each end of the town of Wounded Knee. At first, extending quite a ways out, maybe a mile out almost, from the town, the perimeter. And also then we had a meeting of all the security, the warriors, the veterans inside Wounded Knee, and we set out a plan. First, we had to secure the store because that's where the food was. We didn't think we was going to be surrounded. We just thought, well, we're going to stay here, camp at Wounded Knee. But then, through the night, then more police start coming. They start surrounding us. There was occasional gunfire, and so we had to make a choice that we were going to stay. And then they, in turn, blocked the roads further down from where our perimeter was. So it was kind of a standoff there on the first 24 hours, 36 hours. And then as more and more information started coming to us from inside Pine Ridge, the U.S. Marshals began to organize themselves, set up a perimeter outside our perimeter, and then they were calling in FBI from all over the country. And then as time went on, within a very few days, shipments of weapons, army trucks were seen going up to the Pine Ridge boarding school and entering into the small village of Pine Ridge, and people would tell us about this. So we knew that we ourselves had to put together a plan. So the veterans and others of us, as I said, got together and we decided to build some bunkers, because if they were going to militarily attack us, at least we were going to put up some resistance until we were able to put forth the reasons why we were there. Because we knew ourselves that word was spreading very fast about this takeover of Wounded Knee, which in itself in history has been a very significant part of American history, often portrayed as the last Indian War between the cavalry and the U.S., always portrayed as a war that they killed over 300 men, women, and children and gave over 20 Congressional Medals of Honor at this massacre. But as we know, growing up, even in the reservation schools, it was called the war, the last war at Wounded Knee.
Shootout between some FBI agents and American Indian Movement people, and one AIM member was killed and 2 FBI agents were killed, and ever since Leonard Peltier has been in jail for being accused of killing the agents, although everyone on the reservation and beyond knows that it was a gross miscarriage of justice. Some people estimate that housing is about 17 people on average per house, which is on invariably a trailer house that's barely holding itself together. And I personally had the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs a few years ago tell me that housing was only 4% funded, in terms of they only had 4% of the money that it would take to get it up to a kind of livable standard. There's a town on its edge which apparently has a per capita income average about $1,500 a year, which is a fifth of Namibia's. And men have a life expectancy there of their mid-40s, which is actually lower than any country on earth if you take AIDS, malaria, and war out of those statistics. But it's many things. It's a dysfunctional place, but it's also a magical place. People there have an incredibly hard life, but there's also a lot of laughter to be heard. And a lot of the elder women in particular that I've met there over the years have been probably the strongest individuals I've ever met in my lifetime. They also have been recorded in Shannon County as having the highest percentage voting Democrat of any county in the whole United States. Although ironically, I think a lot of people there wonder what anyone in any of the political parties give them.
Now, June 26th was yesterday, and it may not be a day that stands out to all Americans as a very important day of remembrance, but for Native Americans, it is remembered very well as the day of anguish. It is the anniversary of a shootout that erupted between the FBI and the residents on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Now, the incident led to the conviction of American Indian Movement activist Leonard Peltier. who 3 decades later, more than that, is still in prison. To the FBI, Peltier is the murderer of 2 of their agents, but to many of Peltier's supporters, ranging from foreign parliaments to the Dalai Lama and the late Mother Teresa, he is a political prisoner, had an unfair trial, and deserves clemency. Earlier, I spoke with one of those supporters, Brian Becker. He's the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition, and he has organized protests on Peltier's behalf. I asked him, Peltier is in his 60s. He has served more than 3 decades in prison. He's had a stroke, has diabetes, is partially blind. On humanitarian grounds, as many of his supporters call for, what is wrong with clemency? Here's what he said.
There's nothing wrong with clemency. Leonard Peltier should not be in prison. He should have never been in prison. He's the victim of an FBI witch hunt, the frame-up, the individual who's been held culpable for what was a conflict, a very deep-rooted conflict between the Native American communities in that part of the country and the FBI, which was conducting the COINTEL program, the counterintelligence program, designed to destroy the American Indian movement, which, like the Black Panther Party, which championed rights for black people, they were championing the rights of indigenous people, Native people. And, of course, on a humanitarian basis, Leonard Peltier should be released immediately. He's also the victim of a frame-up, and it's only because of the FBI's war against Leonard Peltier. It's the war against really the progressive Indian community that he remains in prison.
Now, the FBI does not see it this way. They see it as a case closed. However, there is a lot of compelling evidence that shows that whether you agree with the FBI or Peltier's supporters, there's a lot of evidence that he didn't have a fair trial. Witnesses that recanted, witnesses' testimonies that the FBI later admitted they knew were false, perjury when they extradited him from Canada to the United States. So given all of this, why haven't they paroled him when he was up for parole in 2009, for example?
This is the problem in the United States. If an FBI agent or a police law enforcement officer is killed, those entities become lobbies that refuse to allow any sort of consideration for unfair trial, prosecutorial misconduct, tampered evidence, all of which is rampant through the Leonard Peltier case and many other cases. They refuse to allow it. They want to make it a badge, a signal, a symbol that no one who's convicted ever of killing a police agent or law enforcement will ever go free. That's sort of an article of faith in the United States. So even though the trial was a farce, even though the evidence was turned out to be fraudulent, and even though the main witnesses for the FBI told the courts later that they had been arm-twisted by the FBI, that they were fighting for their own lives, that they succumbed to pressure, even with all of that, the FBI won't let it go. There was a lot of rumors that Bill Clinton would pardon Leonard Peltier, so the FBI actually organized demonstrations around the country to protest against the possible parole or probation of Leonard Peltier. This is a lobby by the FBI, which really is culpable for the murder of many scores of Native American activists, and trying to say historically, if there was violence, it was all because of the indigenous people, not the FBI's ongoing covert war against the Indian people.
I know that that's something that supporters like yourself argue. What is the most compelling piece of evidence of that?
Well, we know from the church hearings in 1976, these were Senate hearings, that the COINTELPRO operation by the FBI targeted political activists. They targeted them for assassination, surveillance. They tried to create divisions within groups. In the case of the American Indian movement, that was rampant. That's all part of the record. And we can see from the evidence from the trials that the prosecution and the FBI asserted that these agents have been executed at short range. That wasn't true. They said that the vehicle belonged to Leonard Peltier. That wasn't true. All of the evidence turned out in subsequent hearings to be untrue, but nonetheless, Leonard Peltier is politically isolated because the FBI is a powerful lobby in the United States, affecting unfairly the outcome of this court case.
You mentioned Clinton possibly being considered that he would pardon Peltier. Now, Obama is one who's come out in support of Native Americans when he was elected, and at the annual conference, the Native American Tribal Conference, he said so long as he holds office, never again would Native Americans be forgotten or ignored. He didn't bring up or acknowledge Peltier. How important is that to any semblance of his support of Native Americans? Where do you rank it or rate it as far as acknowledging it and granting clemency?
I would say Leonard Peltier is to the Native American, Indian, indigenous population in the United States what Nelson Mandela was in South Africa. He is the symbol of a struggle for freedom, for civil rights, for justice. They believe, the Native people and many other people, including the Italian Parliament, the Belgian Parliament, the European Union, that he is the victim of an unfair trial. He is the victim of a frame-up. So this has emotional significance for indigenous people still fighting for their rights all over the United States. It is the cardinal case for Indian people.
And a symbol that continues after this last day of anguish that we saw over the weekend. I want to thank you so much. That was Brian Becker, National Coordinator of the Answer Coalition.
According to tribal leaders, over 30 deaths are in need of reinvestigation. Between 1973 and 1976, the homicide rate in Pine Ridge was 170 for every 100,000. In comparison, the murder rate in Detroit is 50 for every 100,000, and the national average is 9.7 per 100,000.
When the oppressors succeed with their illegal theft and depredations, it's called colonialism. When their efforts to colonize indigenous peoples are met with resistance or anything but abject surrender, it's called war. When the colonized peoples attempt to resist their oppressions and defend themselves, we're called criminals. I call it injustice.